On to segment 3, which is to take the analysis down to one deeper level of specificity or granularity. The Cassidy article quotes Gary Becker, who, be it noted, has not departed from his views that the free market is a much better force for growth than government intervention, as saying this, quote, a major cause of the crisis, Becker, excuse me, I'm quoting Cassidy, but he's referring to Becker. A major cause of the crisis, Becker said, was that Wall Street financial engineers devised a series of new instruments that neither they nor the people who traded them fully understood. Close quote. Even granting the arguments that the two of you have made so far, isn't that, from Gary Becker, friend and apostle of Milton Friedman and himself a Nobel Prize winner, isn't this a serious problem for free market analysis?
Yes.
That here you have highly intelligent, very well-paid people doing things that are not in their interest. The entire market on Wall Street, as regards these collateralized mortgage obligations and the credit defaults, that all got screwed up. The market did screw up, right?
I think that you have to think of where the government was going into this. You know, I mentioned Fannie and Freddie as encouraging the origination of such mortgages in the first place. And then you have to think about, we had this sense of what would the government do if there was a problem. And I think the expectation the government would come in and bail out, as in fact they did, reduce the efforts that people made to look at the complexity of these instruments. Plus, we were helping the rating agencies by giving them specific endorsement on the government side. So I think it was a lot of things. I want to say people make mistakes in the private sector every day. There's firms in this Silicon Valley where we're sitting, firms fail. It's the nature of capitalism. It doesn't always work. But in this case, you had this rather large effort by the government.
I'm a 27-year-old quant jock on Wall Street getting paid $750,000 a year with a doctorate from MIT and maybe did a master's at Chicago. And I say, wow, fiddling with my computer, my Bloomberg, there are ways of slicing and dicing these mortgages. We can create entirely new products. And then I go to my risk control officer, and the risk control officer says to himself, at some level, he either senses this or he understands it explicitly, money is loose. The government is encouraging Freddie and Fannie to create and sustain a market in subprime mortgages, meaning the whole mortgage market is going wild. And if we do screw up, somehow or other, the government will save us.
Well, the implicit guarantee...
Is that correct? And that's correct. And so he says to the 27-year-old quant jock, do it. Go ahead, I don't care. The risk is, right?
I think the implicit guarantee is one of the issues. I also think that there are other issues. The question as to how you value these things depends not only on the evaluations at the time that they're put together, but it's what happens to these notes after these pools are formed. So if you change the regulation that deals, for example, with foreclosure, the properties of the notes 6 months into these deals is very different from the ones that they were before. And so again, it's a question of anything that you do with respect to an underlying interest will work its way through all of these things. The second problem, which I think is a technical one, which people won't make again, is I think they were implicitly using normal distributions with very low probabilities at the tails. And in a world of high degrees of government regulation, essentially you have to assume that something which is 4 standard deviations from the median is going to be more likely to happen than it would have been in an unregulated situation.
So they got the risk profiles of these.
Well, that's it, in part because
Richard,
they don't understand.
Let me return to you, though. You said earlier, in our previous segment, you said when the mortgages start to go underwater, the correct response is to leave it to the banks to make the decision whether to foreclose or renegotiate. But that's part of the point. Nobody could figure out who held these mortgages. Well, these things have been sliced and diced and sold away from your local home savings and loan through some huge instrument. You could end up with Hong Kong, some bank in Hong Kong holding, right? So how do you renegotiate?
No. What happens is when they do these syndications in the first place, what happens is you create somebody who does have the powers for renegotiation. But what they did is they underpowered that process, and they overpowered the rights to withdraw as an effort to induce people to come in. The next generation of these transactions will cut down on the withdrawal rights, and they will improve the degree of control for renegotiation.
Yes, of course.
On the regulation issue, I mean, there was lots of regulations out there that weren't being enforced very well. Think about the banks, the most heavily regulated part of our financial system. And then you had this toxic assets or these off-balance sheet vehicles, which the regulators didn't bring attention to. So it seems to me it's if you want to think about regulation as a problem, it was the laws on the books were not being enforced properly, and that's the worst thing you do.
So
you don't know what the rules are.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's the uncertainty that introduces into the marketplace, that the bankers don't know what they're going to...
But what can they get away with? Then, of course, you have people who are investing in the banks thinking they're being regulated, and they're not being regulated properly. I think that's a very serious problem.
And also the rating issues are very serious. If you have monopoly rating, it can cause these problems.
One more argument that it strikes me as a layman represents a problem for the free market analysis is this notion of systemic risk. Again, Cassidy quotes Gary Becker as saying that we, the University of Chicago, and Gary says, I, Gary Becker, did not understand the nature of the systemic risk.
Yes, well, that is true.
That is the way to say the way these instruments got in everybody's portfolios. So when one card goes down, or one domino goes down, it knocks down all these institutions at once, right?
Yes, but the problem about it is the source of the systemic risk private panic, or is it government regulation? And the mark-to-market type features, which says that you have to reevaluate your portfolio and liquidate some portion of it under circumstances where you don't meet standard requirements, were both government regulations and on private side. And what it did is it created just that cascade. Selling to a market only makes sense if it's randomized. The moment the risks are highly correlated, nobody will buy because they know if you're selling today, it's going to lower the market, which means that somebody else is going to be in default tomorrow, which means you may as well wait. And this cycle essentially went all the way down until you got to the last stage where the only person could buy would be the government because they didn't have to mark to market.
I think the systemic risk point is ill-defined and can be used to encourage government intervention when it's not needed. So I don't agree with Gary in this respect.
Give me an example of how it could be used.
Well, I can
financial firm, say Bear Stearns, way back in the spring of 2008, says our creditors are not going to be taken care of, so they're going to pull their money out of other banks. We've got to save Bear Stearns without any evidence.
Okay.
Or even take Lehman. Lehman did go through bankruptcy, and it was viewed as one of the sources of the panic. When I look at the data, that was not really where things got worse. It was later when the government intervened and I think scared people.
So a shrewd banker, some big shot on Wall Street, can call Tim Geithner's successor at the New York Fed and scare him to death using the systemic risk argument.
It's like calling for a fire, but we know what fire is. We don't know what
Let me give you another illustration.
Okay,
there is
quickly on this one, Richard.
Something known as the Miller-Moore Amendment, which is being proposed, which with respect to the short-term repo market, overnight loans, is going to allow the government to give it a haircut. That will wreck that particular market. It is a classic form of potential systemic risk, but it's through government regulation which affects all of these bonds.